Well, good morning and good day, I hope for you, hopefully for all of you. I'm very happy to be here, especially as we address the issues of diversity. And I think that there is no more challenging a time to deal with this issue in a very serious and sober manner than now that we have gone through the ultimate transition from an age of Obama to an age of Trump. I think that if anything, whatever your views are politically, which I will not get into, if anything contrasts more and shows the challenges of why we must deal with diversity in a real serious manner, top to bottom, I think that contrast shows what I'm talking about. Why do I say that? Much of my work over the last few decades have been in the area of criminal justice. What I have come to learn is that many people do not understand that how you view criminal justice is basically coming from where your worldview is shaped and your cultural and ethnic and religious background may be. So some people grow up viewing law enforcement one way, others grow up viewing law enforcement another way, based on their environment, based on their how they grew up, where they grew up, and what the positioning was of law enforcement. Or the same with education, or the same with any number of things, including health care. Rather than blame the person on either side for their worldview, if we began having more diversity and common ground experiences, we would understand each other's worldview. And one of the challenges that I think that we've had and been very hypocritical about in the Northeast is that there was less diverse conversations, interactions, than there were that we projected. For example, I was telling an interviewer that in the 1980s, late 1980s, I went and led marches in Howard Beach because a young black man named Michael Griffith was chased to his death because people said he didn't belong in the neighborhood. He was in a car broke down, 1986. He and two friends went to a local pizzeria, asked where they could get help. They said, "What are you doing here? No ends allowed." The neighborhood chased him on the Belt Parkway, and a car ran over him. He was killed. People said, well, it wasn't necessarily race. Those of us that grew up in Brooklyn said, yeah, we knew better than to go to Howard Beach. Said it was race. They said it wasn't. So I said, fine, and I called the motorcade to go to Howard Beach of blacks to show what the reaction would be. I had a technical problem because when I called the motorcade, I didn't even own a car, but I called it anyway. Union leader called me and said, Reverend, we like the idea of a motorcade. Can my guys follow you out? I said, yeah, if I can get a ride with one of your guys. So that's how the famous Howard Beach motorcade started. I had to hustle a ride. But anyway, that's a side note. Don't give that to page 6 or whatever. So we get out to Howard Beach, and we get out the cars, and we walk to the pizzeria. And there was about 150 of us. But there were 300 whites in the surrounding streets screaming, ends go home, ends go home. Now, from my vantage point, we confronted and proved it was a racial incident. To their vantage point, we were invading the neighborhood and indicting the neighborhood. To the media's vantage point, I was a troublemaker. All of it was based on none of us really had ever talked to each other. We talked at each other, and that shaped a lot of the racial landscape of that issue. The same happened later in Bensonhurst, section of Brooklyn, on and on and on. And I argue it happens today. We had 3 cases. around the country just last week. The case in Louisiana, where a young man had been killed in a car, FaceTime live by his girlfriend, Philando Castile. Policeman told him, get your ID. He reaches, he says, I have a licensed gun. Policeman shoots him 7 times, acquitted. Another policeman hung jury in Cincinnati. University of Cincinnati policeman hung jury on the killing of Samuel DuBose. Another case in Milwaukee. How the reactions was based on how you view law enforcement. What is interesting is that in 2017, you have guys like me out here that advocate in terms of some of the social justice issues. You have a president that says, I'm going to be loyal to the police. And in many ways, he and I grew up in the same New York on different sides of the barricade. Because I said to Donald Trump that I wonder if you, who lived not too far from Howard Beach, ever was on our side or the other side of the barricade. Because we act like the civil rights challenges was only down south, when in fact they were up north. One of the reasons guys like me became as controversial as Bertha Lewis is because she just walked in, you know. I know how to name drop and get my audience with me, you know, all that. So one of the reasons we became controversial is it was fashionable to challenge racism in the South. That's them down there. That's Archie Bunker. That's the guys with the overalls and the, but don't, New York is a melting pot. It's the great metropolis. What are you talking about? How dare you, Sharpton or Bertha, talk about racism in New York? So we become controversial for doing the same thing that people in the South were applauded for doing. Because if you ask people, well, why is Al Sharpton controversial? Why is Bertha? Why are they controversial? Well, they talk about racism in New York, and they don't know racism in New York. Really? So if you look at the data, income level, unemployment level, education level, law enforcement, we proved it with stop and frisk. If you look at contracts, if you look at in pension fund investment, who are the money managers, across the board, I can show you southern states that do far better than New York. I'm talking about this morning. So to confront it makes you controversial, but to not confront it makes you conform to a status quo that has not really dealt with the issues of diversity. When I was a student in Tilden High School, they had what they called a group called the Panel of Americans. And the idea was that they would get one of each ethnic group and would tour the schools, and we talk about our different backgrounds, and we got to know each other. The idea was to try to bring young people together in the end of the 60s. I became a freshman until in 68. In 71, I think they started Panel of Americans. I'm still convinced they started it because they got those of us that were causing the marches and the riots in our schools off campus so we could tour the school. We got all A's for one semester because all we did was Panel of Americans and we didn't go to school. And I was a troublemaker till then. My principal used to call my mother every morning to see how I was feeling to know whether we was having school that day. Because if I felt bad, we just call a boycott. So the thing, though, that I learned in Panel of Americans is that people on the other side of the political argument really had no idea of the world in which I lived, I came from, and I took as the natural world. And that I had no idea of their world. And the reason why what you're doing is so important is that we may always debate on the answers, but we need to understand who's in the conversation. So to have greater diversity in the private sector and the public sector is to come to a greater understanding that will lead to greater solutions and greater answers to problems that may not be as diametrically opposed as we thought, is that we come from such different vantage points that we don't know how we find common ground. The only way you're going to know how you get to common ground is to understand what makes you uncommon. And at the end of the day, we can't communicate if we keep these barriers up. So when I say to people, as I just said to you, that the data shows there's still a huge racial gap in New York, they're actually shocked. I'm talking about some of the captains of industry. I've met with some of the leaders of industry that have the big financial offices down here. And how could you say that? We have a mayor with a black wife and a son with an afro. But that does not make New York diverse. That makes the picture of New York diverse. Just like the night Barack Obama was elected president, and all of a sudden people said, by magic, we're in a post-racial generation. Like the epiphany had come. No, we won an election. And Donald Trump came right behind him for all of you that felt we had died and went to heaven. So the reality is that unless we seriously from the bottom up deal with the issues of exclusion and polarization, which leads us to real efforts of diversity across the board in education and finance, in all that matters in life, then we will only continue a situation and a problem that keeps the nation from growing and keeps the city and state from developing and passes it on to the next generation. I've been in these battles for decades. I'm on my second Cuomo. I fought Mario and I'm now on Andrew. And I'm telling you that unless we start having honest dialogue and honest exchange and dealing with raw facts, we will continue to have the same problem manifested in different ways. So my encouragement to you is don't go my way or the other way. Find your way, but do it with real dialogue, with real facts on the table. And ask yourself, why are blacks doubly unemployed to whites in New York? Why is the education different with people of color than others? Why are we 2/3 of the taxpayers in the city, but we get less than 1% of the contracts when you're going to build LaGuardia Airport and Kennedy Airport? I mean, how is that? So you tell us, pay our taxes, we pay our taxes, you take tax dollars and you do multi-billion-dollar developments and you use our tax dollars, you give it to others to build them, and then you act like we're begging you if we ask you for a job on the construction site. You're building with our money. I meet with the great financial institutions here and say, why aren't we using some of the black and Latino financial management firms to invest some of the pension funds when it is our money, it's our pensions? I asked unions, some of them 70, 80% of their membership black and Latino, none of their financial managers black and Latino. Yet we say, why can't they lift themselves up by their bootstraps? Because everybody else is wearing our boots. So these are the hard questions that I hope we face. And if there's any good news, and believe me, it takes a lot for me to search and find it, but if there's any good news about the new president, is that we're going to have to face these issues. He is not going to give us a choice. And I think that as closely as I worked with President Obama, a lot of us got too comfortable. And a lot of us thought that we had arrived. And now there has been a sobering of many of us with the election of Trump. We've got to confront them. And we've got to confront these issues together. But the only way we confront them together is we have to have an honest dialogue with each other and understand where we are and why we are and move forward. So I hope what you do will lead toward that. And I hope that we can move the city and the state forward so I won't have to work on my third Cuomo. Thank you very much.